As wild as it sounds, after a year of delays, XDefiant is finally here. With it, we have a whole host of content upcoming for XDefiant that we've got coming, but firstly, I want to take some time to discuss something you should be doing before even jumping into your first game: getting your settings in order. Whether on console or PC, there's some specific game settings that you want to take advantage of, something you want to test out for yourself that are entirely subjective and more. So as we go along, drop your thoughts on the XDefiant launch thus far, if you're looking forward to anything in particular, or whatever it may be you'd like to discuss. If you enjoy the video, do me a huge favor and drop a like on it, and make sure to subscribe for more XDefiant coverage along with other FPS content. I would love to have you in the community as we push towards 600,000 subscribers. But for now, let's talk about these game-changing settings that you should be using in XDefiant. So firstly, let's start out with the gameplay and UI and work our way down here in the settings menu. FOV, that's something that is entirely subjective and preference-based. For me, the sweet spot's right around 110. It allows you to see a lot more of your peripheral vision, but it doesn't go full fishbowl on you. FOV adjustments, though, will allow you for that larger peripheral vision the higher you go, but for the more that you see around you, the targets downrange, especially at distance, will appear smaller. The lower you go, the larger those targets at a distance are, but also you see less of that peripheral vision, and you'll get that visual illusion of actually appearing to be moving slower, but you won't actually be. But anyways, just keep that in mind. One thing that I'd highly recommend is just going into the practice range and, along with plenty other settings, just testing it out and seeing what feels natural to you. ADS field of view, the next thing up on deck here, I'd say to keep that at consistent. Independent will tighten that FOV when ADS. It doesn't end up scaling to that custom FOV you just set if you end up having this as independent. And not only one can that be visually jarring to go in and out of different FOV values all the time, but independent's tighter FOV will also result in more visual recoil since you're more zoomed in on the weapon itself. So I'd recommend consistent for that one. ADS sensitivity transition for the COD feel, make sure that you're using instant on this. That means the moment you hit your input to end up aiming down sight, that's when you end up transitioning to that ADS sensitivity versus a standard sensitivity if you have any alterations to those values. Melee during ADS, I have that as off. It's just preference based. Aiming interrupting reload, though, is something that is subjective, but it will allow you another option to reload cancel if you want to. You can have things like those YY options and the sprint out options, but if you want another one, it'll allow you to aim down sight and it'll cancel that reload. Crouch behavior, I have that as toggle. That's pretty standard for a lot of games. Sprint behavior, tap versus hold. Tap is probably better for your stick so you're not always crushing it whenever you're trying to run. Auto sprint, entirely subjective whether or not you want to automatically start sprinting when you move forward versus not. Just bear in mind though, if you do have the following sprint interrupt reload to be on as a cancel, that'll be something that probably cancels your weapon more times than you'd want to. And again, coming to that sprint interrupting reload, again, entirely subjective, but will allow you to cancel. Slide behavior, I'd personally say tap is preferred. It's quicker too, but if you feel differently, that's totally fine, but I recommend tap. Auto reload weapons and auto switch weapons, that's just something that will kickstart a reload if you're fresh out of a mag, or if you end up running out of ammo entirely, it'll swap to your secondary. Auto grab ledge, I'd recommend off, but again, that's a subjective thing. Damage numbers, I have that set to on. I like that visual representation of what my shots are doing. Enemy health bars, you want that on as well. It will give you just a, again, visual representation of how much damage you've done. And then the last thing that I think is more so imperative to the gameplay and UI settings is minimap rotation. Personally, I prefer to have this off because having this on will rotate your caret icon while your minimap does not move. But if you have this off, it will allow your caret to always be looking north and the minimap will rotate around you, which to me is just easier visually to follow. Now, distance units, meters to yards, entirely subjective. Ping display, that'll just showcase your network ping, so that's just one of those UI elements up in the upper left. And team composition overlay, I don't think you necessarily need this, but it'll essentially just give you more information on what your teammates have throughout the game. As for your controller settings, this is where things start to get really important, I think. Button layout, brawler is what I use. This is the tactical setting from Call of Duty, swapping melee and crouch on your sticks. Always felt that that was more natural to me, but it's entirely different. But if you do like tactical, that's called brawler in XDefiant. Aim assist, you'll want this as standard, otherwise you disable it. That's the only other two options here, but you end up having a couple of different sub settings here with this. The aim response curve type has 3 different settings where it's standard, linear, or reverse S curve. Standard is your standard aiming. Linear aiming is tied directly to the sensitivities of your individual inputs, pushing those thumbsticks, and reverse S curve is the dynamic setting in COD, but it boosts those small and large camera movements while reducing the movements in the mid range of your sticks. They say that's good for mobility. Again, this one is a lot of preference based. I can't really definitively say one is better than the other because it just might not feel true to you. So again, that's one of the ones, along with a couple of these, as we'll mention, that I would highly recommend going into the practice zones and just testing out what feels natural and if you can feel those slight differences in the two. Your horizontal and vertical sensitivities, this truly is all subjective. I can't give you an answer one way or another here. I would highly recommend taking a few seconds and jumping into that practice zone and just simply shooting some dummies or running the practice course to get acclimated to what feels good to you, looking left, right, up, down, seeing what kind of sensitivities is the best. For me, I like higher sensitivity stuff, but that might not be your case as well. So make sure you jump in and try those out. Controller aim look sensitivity factor. This will be your low zoom ADS sensitivity, so your red dots or other similar items like that. This will give a bit more precision, which may be preferred in XDefiant. Personally, I kind of feel like through the last couple of play sessions and initially here that the sensitivities don't feel exactly one-to-one with how other FPS games would be, and that's totally fine, but it's just that adjustment. So if you want to make those slight adjustments while aim down sight versus actually like running or looking around in those sensitivities, that's where you'll end up seeing these types of things. Now, controller aim scope look sensitivity, that's for your higher zooms like sniper rifles. So same thing, but for higher zoomed. Next, dead zone. This is probably the definition of subjective because it is based upon the controller itself. My controller has absolutely some wear and tear. Yours may be brand new in pristine condition, or it might be on its last leg, but that natural drift off target that can cause some controllers to stray from their intended aim point, this dead zone setting will help to combat that. The closer to zero needed, the better, but sometimes you'll need to adjust in order to stop the drift. Increasing the values is basically like introducing a margin on your input that you need to cross in terms of registering that input. So 0, there's no margin. If the controller has any drift, that input, even while untouched, is registered. If you increase it, the higher you increase it, the more genuine force you'll need to apply for that input to be registered. So that is, again, something that is entirely subjective. Play around with that. One thing that I'd highly recommend is going into the practice zone. There's that recoil target where you can end up just putting your aim down sight dot right in the center of that and seeing if it drifts off course. Controller vibration, personally, I see this as kind of a deterrent. I don't really like vibration in my controller. I feel like if you're trying to be pinpoint precise with your aiming, even just that slight rumble in your controller can knock you slightly off target. So I always just turn it off, but totally preference based. Now, graphic settings, initially speaking, console's the only thing that I'd say for this one here is just simply to end up enabling 120 Hz support if you have the ability to. If you've never played anything above 60, it truly is life-changing and I'd highly recommend it. But that's entirely dependent on your monitor or TV if it has that capability to output at 120 Hz. But other than that, console settings are honestly pretty limited here with this. The brightness and contrast, whatever feels good to you on that. But when we go into PC, that's where it has tons more customization. Of course, you have your basic stuff like windowed mode. I'd recommend full screen so you end up getting the full application attention here. Resolution, whatever your native res is, that's what I would stick with. Your refresh rate, I'd recommend maxing to your monitor's potential. If you're unsure where to find that, you can either, one, if you have an NVIDIA GPU, open the NVIDIA control panel, find your way to the display, change resolution, and then you'll see that refresh rate. Or you can go to your PC settings, select advanced display settings, and see your refresh rate and toggle it if necessary. But again, make sure you max that out to whatever you have the ability to so that you're getting the most frames per second and being able to take advantage of all the hardware and tech that you have. Now, as for the rest of the settings, this comes down to a lot of FPS min-maxing per se. So before we jump into those settings in particular, you want to identify what you want. Quality versus FPS. Obviously, playing with your monitor's standard res is optional. Like, you can drop it if you want a slight boost in FPS and less hit on your PC, but ultimately, I don't think that's worth it to drop the resolution itself. Instead, quality options are where you're going to find you can easily min-max without sacrificing any resolution on your game. Competitive level players will focus on lower settings for things like shadow quality, volumetric fog, particle details, those things that are a lot more just fine nitpicky details that like look great for quality, but ultimately they'll hit your FPS totals. So it comes down to if you want to min-max that. If you're fine with the FPS you're getting while maxing everything out graphically, that's totally fine too. I mean, I do that. It's just all subjective on what you want out of it. Another thing that on PC can be advantageous in the video and graphics settings is the NVIDIA Reflex low latency option. This is available for anybody with recent NVIDIA GPUs where you have the options of off, on and on plus boost. Now off, obviously you won't get any sort of effect with it, but on optimizes your system latency to give you a little bit more performance, and then on plus boost is something that will attempt to optimize latency in CPU bound cases as well, but that can increase your GPU power draw. The goal of this obviously just to give you a bit more responsiveness in your inputs, in your gameplay feel, so it is something that if you have one of those cards, I'd recommend playing around with those. Audio settings, this again is a lot of preference based. You have your main volume, dialogue volume, sound effects volume, UI volume, and music volume. Music volume I always turn down. UI volume you can also turn down. It just comes down to what mix you want of the main volume, dialogue volume, and sound effects volume actually in game. That could vary depending on what type of output you end up having, whether it be a TV monitor, a sound bar, headset, whatever the case. Again, a bit more subjective, but you want to make sure you try and mix that properly to your liking. Now, your accessibility settings next, there's one in particular that I think is very important and one that can really actually be pretty beneficial, is the flashbang effect. Obviously, you have things like your game language, dialogue language, colorblind mode, but your flashbang effect is a newer thing that we're starting to see in games where it will allow you to have a bright or dark effect when flashed. Entirely subjective, but I personally like dark. Bright gets really jarring in some cases. A lot of people, if you play in a darker room, that'll be a real system shock and a wake up if you end up having it as a standard bright and you get flashbanged. It'll just light up your whole room. So it's one of those things that if you don't like the harshness on your eyes when playing, dark might be the way to go for you. And then finally, the last things that I think are very, very important, but again, entirely subjective, are the crossplay and input-based matchmaking settings in the matchmaking and account tab. This will allow you to simply be able to play with other players on different platforms. So if you're on PlayStation, you can play with PC and Xbox. If you're on Xbox, you can play with PlayStation, PC, Xbox, and PlayStation. It just allows that larger window of matchmaking to open up. But in recent years, of course, people have had issues with this because you might be subjected to a lot more cheaters than if crossplay is off. But that is something that you have the ability to control that here in game. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Xbox don't have my Series X hooked up at the moment while recording this, but pretty sure that we don't have that actually in game. But it's something that Mark Rubin, executive producer on the project of XDefiant, did mention that that's something that Microsoft and Xbox want you to use the crossplay settings actually in the Xbox settings, not in the game. So that's something to consider there. And then input-based matchmaking is kind of similar, but also not. It allows you to be able to play, again, cross-platform, but only with the input that you end up having. So if you play on controller and you have input-based matchmaking selected as on, you'll only match with other controller players. If you have it off, you'll have that mix of controller versus mouse and keys, but again, entirely subjective. Some people just like to play against other controller players. Some people like to have the mixture. It's really all up to you. But that is the settings that I would highly recommend here for the launch of XDefiant and going forward. So let me know your thoughts down below. Is there any particular that you guys are liking? Do you like the input-based matchmaking, the crossplay selection, the custom flashbang effect, any of the graphic settings? Whatever the case, let me know your thoughts down below. But if you guys enjoyed the video, you found it at all insightful, do me a huge favor and drop a like on it. And of course, make sure you subscribe for more XDefiant content. We have a lot upcoming here in the coming days to weeks with a launch, and I'd love to have you in the community if you guys would like to stay here. So that said, that is going to wrap it up. I'll see you guys out there. Get to ranking up your stuff, and I'll see you later. Take care, and peace.